Anybody can get a snare drum or a bass drum to sound pretty decent. But the toms, however, that's where you need to start using your ears. What's going on, everybody? Nick Costa here, and welcome to this video on how to tune toms. In this video, I'm going to go through the process that I use to tune toms on any of my drum kits. Now, although there are a lot of variables with drums, including various species of wood and size, this process that I will show you is a good general rule of thumb to tune your toms. In this video, I will be replacing both the top and bottom heads. Now, the toms being used in this video are from my Ludwig Classic Maple kit. Now, the sizes are an 8x12 rack tom and a 14x16 floor tom. By the way, depth size followed by diameter is the industry standard on identifying tom sizes. Now, the reason why I'm using the toms from my Classic Maple kit is because, in my opinion, the Classic Maples are a great workhorse set of drums. Regardless of the style of music, you can use these in any situation and have an amazing sound. Now, for the drum nerds out there, Classic Maples are 7-ply maple shells. They have a 45-degree interior bearing edge with a slight round over. So, let's go ahead and get started with the tuning process. Alright, so here we are set up at a table, and you can see that I put a cloth down underneath the tom to mute the bottom head. When we get into actually tuning the drum, this is really important because you want to make sure that only one of the heads is resonating when you're tuning. Now, when it comes to tuning drums, there are multiple tools, but the easiest one is a drum key. The Remo Quick Key, however, is my favorite because of the fact that it has a magnetic base, so when you attach it to a tension rod, it stays in place. You'll also notice at the top of the key that there's a hex fitting so you can attach it to a drill. This will allow you to quickly remove a drum head. I will advise you, however, do not use a drill to tighten anything on a drum. Now, another tool is an electronic tuner, like the TuneBot here. Think of the TuneBot like a guitar tuner. You attach it to the hoop of the drum, and then you can actually analyze the frequency of each tension rod point. Now, with my experience using a TuneBot, I've noticed that although it says that each tension rod point is at the same frequency, when I tap the area by ear, it sounds completely different. Now, if you want to rely on something like the TuneBot, that's totally fine, but at the end of the day, rely on your ears. They won't lie to you. You can use the TuneBot to get started, but switch over to your ears afterwards to really fine-tune the drum head. Now, when it comes to tuning toms, I always start with the bottom head. Believe it or not, that's where the majority of your tone is coming from. If we were to talk about the physics of a drum, you're taking a stick and you're striking the top head. That kinetic energy is then transferred through the head to the shell and works its way down to the bottom of the drum until the bottom head starts to resonate. Now, keeping all of that in mind, although you only hit the top head, you still need to replace the bottom head. So that's where I'm going to start first. I'm going to flip the tom over and remove the bottom head. So I'm going to grab my Remo Quick Key and I'm going to loosen one of the tension rods to the point that I can continue to remove it by hand. Once I get to that point, I'm going to go across the drum and do the same thing. When loosening or tightening a drum, you want to go in a cross-star pattern. This allows you to equally adjust tension across the drum rather than on one side before the other. In this case, I loosened one lug and then I went across the drum to loosen the next one. I then continued that process in a star configuration until all tension rods were loose. Now that they are, grab the hoop and the head and remove them from the drum. Now, with the hoop and the head removed, you want to remove any dust, dirt, or debris that could be around that bearing edge. Now, it may be hard to see here, but there is a lot of dust buildup on the bearing edge. And the last thing you want is that getting in between the bearing edge of the shell and the drum head. You can also see that some debris fell into the drum shell, so simply flip it over and shake it to remove it. You can also take a microfiber cloth and simply wipe all of that stuff out. So now I'm going to take a microfiber cloth and wipe down that bottom bearing edge. While I'm here, I'm also going to wipe down the rest of the shell. Now, some people will say that you should remove both top and bottom hoops and heads and then wipe down your shells. I personally don't like to do this unless I am thoroughly cleaning my drums, where I'm taking them completely apart. Since I am not doing that this time around, I am simply just going to wipe the drum down to get rid of any excess dust and continue with replacing the drum heads. Now that I know the bearing edge is clean, this is a perfect time to inspect it to make sure that there are no dips, craters, or separation of plies. Now to check for dips and craters, simply take your finger and run it around the bearing edge. If it feels smooth, you're good. If it feels as if it's going up and down and it's rough, you may have an imperfection somewhere. You also want to take a look at the plies and make sure that there's no separation or gaps between them. Obviously, with humidity changes, climate changes, the wood will actually start to expand and contract and can cause some of those things to happen. Now, any of those imperfections to your bearing edge is going to make it more difficult to tune the drum. If it's minor, you might be okay. If it's really bad, you might want to get a professional to recut the bearing edges. Now for drum heads, I'm going to install a Remo Ambassador Clear, which is a 1-ply head on the bottom, and a white Suede Emperor, which is a 2-ply head on the top. Since I'm starting with the bottom of the drum, I'm going to grab the Ambassador Clear. I'm going to flip it so the logo lines up with the badge on the shell and place it on the bearing edge. Now this isn't necessary, but if you are particular about details like I am, you're going to want to make sure the drum head logo lines up with the badge on the shell. Once you do that, you're going to want to grab your hoop and wipe down the inside flange, again, to remove any dirt, debris, or residue. While you're at it, you can also wipe down the outside of the hoop to remove any excess dust. It's now time to reinstall the hoop to the drum. Simply line up your tension rods with the receiver tubes of your lugs. Insert the tension rods into those receiver tubes and then begin to finger tighten the tension rods. Once again, you are adjusting tension and you want to go across the drum rather than adjusting one side before the other. You can do this by following that cross star pattern that I mentioned earlier. Now, when you are adding tension to a drum head, you want to start out by finger tightening all of the tension rods. This is the closest way to confirm that all of them are pretty close in tension. Now that that's done, I'm going to grab my Remo quick key and I'm going to do one full turn on each tension rod. Again, going across the drum, not in a circle. Now once you do that, take a look at the drum head and check for any wrinkles towards the edge. If they're really bad, you'll see them, but if they're minor, you'll feel them if you run your finger across. Now if you do discover a wrinkle, let's say at a tension rod point, you want to tighten that specific tension rod. If you see a wrinkle between two tension rod points, you want to adjust both of those tension rods. Again, we're trying to get equal tension here. Taking a look at this bottom head, it looks pretty good. There are no wrinkles that I can see, so this is a great starting point. So now you want to flip the drum over with that head facing up, and we want to seat the head. The easiest way to do this is to apply some pressure to the center of the head, just like you're giving CPR. This is the same procedure that I demonstrated during the How to Tune a Snare Drum video. A quick little tip, however, depending on the type of drum head depends on how much pressure you apply. For example, if you're replacing a really thin head, like the bottom of a snare drum, the last thing you want to do is apply a lot of pressure. Doing so could break the head or cause a dent. Now the bottom head on a tom is thicker than the bottom of a snare drum, so you can apply a little bit more pressure. You just don't want to go crazy with it. Now since all tension rods were finger tightened, the last thing you want to do is get the grease from them on the drum head. Easiest way to prevent this is to take something like a towel or maybe even a plastic bag and put it between your hands and the drum head. In this case, I'm taking the plastic bag the drum head came in and putting it on top of the head. Now simply apply a little bit of pressure to the center of the head as if you're giving CPR. Now while you do this, you may hear some crackling. That is totally normal. It's actually the collar of the drum head. That's just going to help stretch out the drum head a little bit and seat it properly to the bearing edge of the shell. So now it's time to check the pitch around the tension rod area. Simply take your finger and tap on the edge of the drum head. You're going to notice that each tension rod may sound different. Most of the time, tension rods that are across from one another are going to sound the same. Any discrepancies that you do hear are usually to the tension rods that are to the left or the right of one another. So take the pitch from one of your tension rods and use it as a guide to match the rest. If you notice that a pitch is lower, you then tighten that tension rod a little bit. If it's higher, you then loosen it a little bit. One thing to keep in mind, however, is if you do adjust the tension rod and it sounds like it's the same pitch, the tension rod that is across from it will affect the sound, as well as the two tension rods to the left and the right. Now, the tension adjustments are super minor, so if you're noticing there is no difference, go across the drum, adjust that a little bit. See if that affects it. If it doesn't, then check those tension rods to the left and the right. See if those affect it. Unfortunately, with a drum, you are messing around with semitones, so these minor adjustments make a huge difference. Continue this process until all of the tension rod points sound the same. Once they do, it's then time to flip the drum over and remove the top head. Once again, take your drum key and loosen the tension rod till it gets to a point where you can continue to remove it using your fingers. Again, make sure that you are loosening them in that cross star configuration. While you're doing this, you also want to take a note as to where the tom mount bracket is located. On my drum, it's the next set of lugs that's to the side of the badge. Once again, this is not necessary, but if you do like to pay attention to detail, you do want to make sure those badges are facing forward. Now, since I use a Ludwig Vibra mount, it is difficult to loosen the tension rod by hand. So in this case, I have to use the drum key the entire time. Best part about this Remo quick key is that it is magnetic. Once that tension rod is completely loose, just pick up the key. Now for my rack tom, I use what Ludwig calls a Vibra mount. The mount is a second rim that goes partially around the drum and is held in place by tension rods. This is my preferred tom mount because you're not drilling the bracket directly into the shell. Now, if you do prefer to have the bracket attached to the shell, you could replace one of the lugs with Ludwig's Atlas tom mount. It's a built-in lug and bracket all in one. Once all tension rods are completely loose, again, remove the hoop and top head. Once again, you want to wipe down that bearing edge area to get rid of any dust or debris. One thing to keep in mind, however, with the top head, you're going to get a lot of stick shavings. So once again, take a microfiber cloth, wipe down the bearing edge, and wipe down the rest of the shell. And again, check the bearing edge for any dips, craters, or separation of plies. Once you do that, it's time to install the new head. Once again, you're going to take the logo on the head and line it up with the badge on the shell. Now before you go and grab your hoop, if you have a Vibra mount, you're going to notice rubber washers. Those washers actually sit on top of the receiver tube of the lug. So you want to make sure that they're still in place. If they're not, make sure that that receiver tube is sitting inside the rubber washer. Now that the Vibra mount is in place, grab your hoop and wipe down that inside flange. Once you do that, wipe down the outside of the hoops to get rid of any excess dust. Now that the hoop is clean, again, take your tension rods and line them up with the receiver tubes of the lugs on the drum. Now because of the rubber washers on the Vibra mount, you might have to take some of your tension rods and insert them into the receiver tubes of the lugs. Once you do, you'll notice you can't finger tighten those tension rods. Now you want to make sure you have equal tension, and the last thing you want to do is finger tighten some of those tension rods and not the others that are covered by the Vibra hoop. To make this easier, grab your drum key and tighten down on the tension rod until the bottom of the head touches the washer below. Once again, make sure you're tightening the tension rods in that cross star pattern. Once you have your tension rods at the same point, it's time to inspect that head, check for any wrinkles around the edge. Once again, if you see a wrinkle right at a tension rod point, tighten that specific one If you see a wrinkle between two tension rod points, tighten both of them. If the edge of the drum head is nice and smooth, you now want to go around and do a full turn on each tension rod. And this is your friendly reminder to make sure you're staying in that cross star pattern. Once you do that, you now want to seat the head. Again, put something between the head and your hands and slightly apply pressure to the center of the head. Now you want to check the pitch at each tension rod point and adjust accordingly. Now that both heads are in tune with one another, it's time to check and make sure that that top head is lower in pitch than your bottom head. Simply tap on a tension rod point of the top head, flip the drum over, and mute that top head with your hand. Then tap on a tension rod point of the bottom head. As long as that bottom head is higher in pitch, you're good to go. Now in this case, the bottom head is higher in pitch, but that top head sounds like it's a little choked out. So I'm going to lower the pitch just a little bit. Now when it comes to tone, there are a ton of variables including drum shell configuration, bearing edge type, the type of drum head you use, and even the brand who makes the drum. Regardless of all of that, every drum has a sweet spot. Now some companies will stamp a specific pitch to the inside of the shell, while others might provide you a pitch range. You'll know that that drum is in its sweet spot when it starts to open up and really start to resonate. So if that drum sounds muddy, it's probably too low. If it sounds choked, it may be too high. Once again, you want to make sure you're trusting your ears and listening to how the drum sounds. Once you think the drum is in tune, suspend it and test it out. Now it's time to move on to the floor tom. And just like the rack tom, we're going to start with the bottom head. So once again, I'm going to loosen the tension rods in a cross star pattern. I'm going to loosen those tension rods to a point where I can continue to loosen them by hand. Next, remove the bottom hoop and head. Just like before, clean the bearing edge area by wiping it down with a microfiber cloth to get rid of any dust or debris. This is also another great time to check the bearing edge for any dips or valleys, as well as any ply separation or gaps. Next, take your microfiber cloth and just remove any excess dust from the shell. Now remember, this is the bottom of the drum, so I'm going to take my single ply Remo Clear Ambassador. I'm going to make sure that the logo lines up with the badge on the shell, and I'm going to place it on the drum. Next, I'm going to grab the hoop and I'm going to wipe down that inside flange, as well as remove any excess dust from the outside. Now it's time to reinstall the hoop. Make sure that your tension rods are in line with the receiver tubes for your lugs. Next, finger tighten all of the tension rods, again in a cross star pattern. Once all of your tension rods are finger tight, take your drum key and do one full turn at each tension rod. Once again, make sure you're tuning in a cross star pattern. After that initial full turn at each tension rod, you then want to put some slight pressure on the center of the head to help seat it to the bearing edge. Once again, it is totally normal to hear any crackling while you do this. That is just the collar of the head starting to seat itself. Next, you want to check the pitch near each tension rod. Just remember, there are 3 tension rods that affect the one that you're getting the tone from. the one that's directly across from it, as well as the ones to the left and the right. Now, if for any reason you're having a difficult time hearing the pitch at the tension rod points, simply rest a finger or two in the center of the head and then tap again. This helps mute some of those overtones you might be hearing. Once all points are in tune with one another, it's time to move on to the top head. And just like every other drum head, take your key, start loosening the tension rods in a cross-star pattern until you can remove the head and the hoop. Once again, grab your microfiber cloth and wipe down any dust or debris that's on your bearing edge. You can also use this time to wipe down the rest of the shell. Take your top head, which in this case I'm using an Emperor white suede. Make sure the logo lines up with the badge on the drum shell. Once again, take that hoop and wipe the inside flange with your microfiber cloth. You can also remove any excess dust from the outside as well. Once again, when reapplying the hoop, make sure your tension rods are in line with the receiver tubes of your lugs, and then begin to finger tighten each tension rod. And just like before, take your drum key and do one full turn at each tension rod. Remember to do this in a cross star pattern. After that initial turn, again you're going to apply some pressure to the center of the head to help it seat to the bearing edge. Check for any wrinkles and tighten the corresponding tension rods if needed. Now it's time to fine-tune each tension rod point. Now, although you initially start in a cross-star pattern, when you're adjusting and fine-tuning, you're not really adjusting tension that much, so it's okay to go in a clockwise rotation. When you're making those minor adjustments, that is the only time you should go in a clockwise rotation. Now, just like everything else, over time your ears will start to fatigue. If that does happen, just stop and take a break. Come back to tuning a little bit later when you have fresh ears. This, believe it or not, will actually save you time and a ton of frustration. Now that both heads are in tune with one another, it's time to check them and make sure that your bottom head is higher pitched than your top head. Once again, make sure that one of the heads is muted and tap at a tension rod point on the other head. Once you confirm that the bottom head is higher pitched than the top, test it out by tapping with a stick and see how it sounds. Okay, we are back at the kit. Toms are set up. It's time to now test them out and see what they sound like. Now for this recording, you're only going to be hearing 3 microphones. My overheads, which are blue hummingbirds, and my kick drum mic, which is an AKG D112. Alright, so you can hear the toms sound pretty good. Now if you like the way that these toms sound, believe it or not, they are actually higher tuned than you think. Now in order for you to hear that, I'm going to isolate each drum on my drum throne so you can hear what both the top and bottom head for each drum sounds like. Here's what the bottom head sounds like. Okay, and here's what the top head sounds like. And here is the bottom head on the floor tom. All right, here's what the top head sounds like. There is no better feeling than new drum heads on your kit. Maybe putting on a new pair of shoes for the first time, but then again, there is that break-in period. So one thing to keep in mind, once your drums are tuned up and they're starting to be played a little bit more, they're going to stretch a little bit. You may notice that the tone or the pitch of the toms might start to lower. If that does happen, just make sure that you check both your top and bottom head. You want to make sure that each tension rod point is in tune with one another. This is something you should check throughout the lifespan of the heads on your kit, but when you first put the heads on the drums, you'll notice that pitch adjust a little bit more frequently. Now, if you have any questions on how to tune your toms, or if you need insight on specific types of heads, feel free to reach out to me at nickcostamusic.com, or feel free to leave a comment below. I'll try and help out any way that I can. Also, feel free to leave a comment below letting me know what you think of the tone using Remo White Suede Emperors on the top and Clear Ambassadors on the bottom. While you're here, also make sure to hit the subscribe button as well as the bell notification. That way you get notified anytime I upload a new video to the channel. And that is it. Thank you so much for checking out this video on how to tune your toms. Hopefully you've gotten some information from it. And until next time, see you later.